Epilogue for the parents. Hello, I'm Alexander von der Fellen, the host of the NextGen Mentor podcast series. I've had the pleasure of mentoring your NextGen family member, and I hope that you're already beginning to see a change in them, a change in their understanding of and relationship with your family's wealth. I also hope that I've helped prepare them for the responsibility, complexity, and expectations that so often accompany wealth. That process is now complete. And so this final, additional session is for you, whether you're a parent, grandparent, uncle, aunt, trustee, or simply someone who forms part of the system around them. Because I need your help. Over the course of this series, I've tried to do something quite simple. I've tried to explain to your next-gen family member what it actually feels like to grow up around substantial wealth and responsibility. Many of the conversations we had were not technical. We didn't spend much time discussing tax structures, investment allocation, governance models, or legal frameworks. Now, those things matter, of course, but they're not the real source of uncertainty. The uncertainty sat somewhere else entirely. It sat in questions like these. What is expected of me? How much of my life is actually my own? What role am I supposed to play in this family? How do I become independent without distancing myself from the people I love? How do I contribute to something that existed long before I arrived? And, perhaps most importantly, how do I become competent enough to carry the responsibility that I did not create, but will one day inherit? Those are difficult questions for young people to ask openly, particularly inside successful families. One of the things that I've observed repeatedly over the past 3 decades, working with families like yours, is that many next-gen family members grow up very close to wealth, but very far from understanding it. They experience the outcomes of the system without really seeing the system itself. And because the system mostly functions so well, it creates a perfectly understandable assumption in their minds that the system itself is somehow automatic. Until one day they realize that it's not, that behind the comfort sits structure, behind the structure sit decisions, and behind decisions sit people carrying very large amounts of responsibility, often for many years. People like you. Your next-gen member is now beginning to understand that wealth is not just financial, that it's structural, psychological, relational. And when that realization arrives without preparation, it can be overwhelming. Not because the young person is weak, not because they're incapable, but because they're suddenly trying to understand something that has been operating around them for most of their life without being properly explained. I suspect that you may already recognize this pattern in your own family. And if so, I want to say something clearly before we go any further. This is not criticism. Most parents and founders do not create this distance intentionally. In fact, almost always, the opposite is true. The distance is usually created out of love, out of protection, out of a desire to allow children to enjoy a normal life for as long as possible. That instinct is deeply human, deeply understandable, and often well-intentioned. But over time, protection can slowly become separation. Not physical separation, but emotional and structural separation. Children grow up inside the outcomes of a system without gradually being introduced to the logic underneath it. And when that happens, a gap forms between access and understanding, between privilege and competence, between visibility and preparedness. Now, at first, that gap is almost invisible. But eventually, usually much later than expected, responsibility begins to move towards the next generation. And at that point, the gap suddenly becomes visible to everyone, including the young person themselves. I sat many years ago with the son of a highly successful Japanese family shortly after the death of his father. He was deeply spiritual, intelligent, thoughtful, well-educated, and scrupulously polite. He appeared entirely prepared for what lay ahead, but during one conversation he stopped, looked at me, and said, "I think I've inherited something that I don't understand." Underneath that sentence sat something else: fear. Not fear of losing money, but fear of not being capable enough, fear of disappointing the family, fear of making poor decisions inside a system that everyone else seemed to understand far better than he did. Many next-gen family members spend years trying to appear more comfortable than they actually feel. They listen carefully in meetings, they learn the language, they observe structures, but internally, they're often still trying to answer much more basic questions. What exactly is my role here? How much responsibility am I genuinely expected to carry? What happens if I make mistakes? Am I being prepared properly or simply gradually exposed? They aren't technical questions, they're human, and if they remain unanswered for too long, some young people can become passive. They can defer excessively to advisors, trustees, executives, or even stronger family personalities because they do not yet trust their own judgment. Others can move in the opposite direction. They can become reactive. They can challenge prematurely. They can try to establish independence before they have fully developed clarity. And some can drift, not rebellious drift, not irresponsible, just disconnected from the system they are expected one day to help carry. This is one of the great misunderstandings in successful families. Parents often interpret hesitation as lack of motivation. The next gen, however, often experiences it as uncertainty. They're not the same thing. The young person may not be resisting responsibility at all. They may simply still be trying to locate themselves inside something that's far larger than themselves. And this becomes even more difficult because wealth rarely transfers only assets. It also transfers emotion, history, patterns of behavior, expectations, unresolved tensions, family myths, silences, sometimes even fear itself. I've seen families with extraordinary financial sophistication and almost no emotional language whatsoever around inheritance, succession, or responsibility. Everything technical, prepared beautifully, very little discussed at all. And eventually, governance structures, trusts, holding companies, constitutions, advisory frameworks all rely on one thing underneath them, and that is human judgment. And judgment is not inherited. It has to be developed slowly through participation, explanation, observation, and small responsibilities executed over time, not all at once under pressure. This, I think, is one of the most important shifts you can make in your thinking as parents. Preparing children for wealth is not about information. It's about orientation, helping them gradually understand what the system is, why it exists, what risks it's trying to manage, what responsibilities accompany it, and what role they may eventually play within it. Without that orientation, many next-gen family members experience wealth as something slightly abstract and emotionally slightly confusing. Present everywhere but rarely discussed directly, and when important conversations are delayed too long, younger family members often fill the silence themselves, and usually incorrectly. They assume expectations that may not exist, or misunderstand intentions completely. I've seen young people interpret parental caution as a lack of trust. I've seen parents interpret hesitation as a lack of seriousness. Meanwhile, both sides cared deeply about each other, but were just not having the same conversation. This is why communication matters so much. Gradual conversation, explaining things before they become urgent, allowing younger family members to ask basic questions without embarrassment, giving context, not just conclusions. helping them understand not merely what decisions were made, but also why they were made. That process builds something extremely important: confidence, grounded confidence, the confidence that comes from gradually understanding how the system actually functions. And perhaps even more importantly, the confidence that is acceptable not to know everything immediately. Because competence doesn't emerge fully formed, it develops progressively, exactly as it did for you. There's another aspect of this that I think parents can often underestimate, and that is the emotional effect of competence. Do they feel capable? Do they feel trusted? Do they feel gradually included in a way that allows them to build confidence over time? Or do they feel that responsibility is approaching them like weather approaching across the horizon? Visible, inevitable, but still poorly understood. There is a considerable difference between these two experiences. One creates engagement, the other creates anxiety. And anxiety inside wealthy families often hides itself very well because there are usually highly functioning environments, intelligent people, well educated people. But beneath that composure, there can be sometimes sitting a very real fear of inadequacy, particularly in families where the previous generation was highly successful. The founder who built the business, the parent who managed complexity effortlessly, the individual around whom everything seemed to function naturally for decades. Children growing up around people like that often absorb a tacit comparison without anyone explicitly creating it, and the comparison usually feels impossible because they're comparing themselves not to the uncertainty that their parents once experienced, but to the finished version of them, the version that has already survived failure, learned judgment, and built authority over 30, 40 years. Young people do not see the uncertainty that existed earlier. They only see the competence that exists now. This can create a very dangerous misunderstanding, the belief that they themselves are somehow not ready enough, not decisive enough, or not naturally capable enough. This is one reason why gradual exposure, while there is still time for questions, mistakes, and development, matters so much. I've seen families where younger members sat quietly in meetings for years without anyone ever properly explaining what was actually happening. Everyone assumed they were learning, and in reality, many were simply observing without context, and observation without explanation does not automatically create understanding. Sometimes it creates confusion disguised as familiarity. The language becomes familiar, the structures become familiar, the people become familiar, but the underlying logic remains unclear, and eventually that gap becomes visible, usually at exactly the wrong moment. One of the greatest gifts families can give younger generations is not immediate authority, but context. Explaining why certain structures exist, why certain risks are managed carefully, why decisions were historically taken in particular ways, why governance matters, why trustees behave cautiously, why advisors disagree, why family businesses often create tensions that are not really about money at all. These conversations matter enormously because they transform wealth from something mysterious into something understandable. And once something becomes understandable, it becomes less emotionally intimidating. There's also another point that deserves saying openly, and that is that many parents can hope that a sense of responsibility will emerge naturally in their children over time. And sometimes it does. But more often than not, that sense of responsibility emerges through involvement, small exposure, gradual participation, allowing younger family members to attend discussions before they're expected to contribute heavily, giving them responsibility in contained ways where mistakes are survivable, allowing them to observe decision making while there is still space to ask naive questions. This matters because judgment develops much more slowly than knowledge. Knowledge can be transferred fairly quickly. Judgment cannot. Judgment is experiential. It develops through seeing consequences unfold over time, understanding trade offs, watching good decisions and poor ones, observing how people behave under pressure, learning how conflict actually emerges, understanding incentives, and gradually recognizing behavioral patterns. None of that can be downloaded in a short period. And this is where I think some families unintentionally create unnecessary difficulty for the next generation. They delay involvement for too long because they're trying to protect their children from pressure. Then suddenly, when circumstances change, they expect maturity to appear quickly under conditions of stress. But emotional readiness rarely develops well under pressure. It develops best through gradual exposure long before pressure arrives. I often think of it like learning to sail. You wouldn't keep someone entirely away from the sea for 20 years and then hand them responsibility during a storm. You would begin in calm conditions. You would explain the weather, the currents, the structure of the boat. You would let them observe first, then participate, then take responsibility gradually. Families sometimes forget that wealth works in a very much the same way. The difficulty is that many successful parents are themselves extremely accustomed to carrying pressure. They solve problems privately. They absorb uncertainty internally. They make difficult decisions without visibly displaying the emotional weight attached to them. From the outside, younger family members often experience this as an effortless competence. But competence is rarely effortless. It is usually the product of accumulated experience, failure, anxiety, anticipation, and time. And one of the most notable things that parents can do is occasionally to allow younger generations to see that reality honestly, not in a way that burdens them, but in a way that humanizes responsibility, so that responsibility stops looking like some mysterious quality possessed only by older generations, and instead becomes something learnable, developable, manageable over time. There is another area where families often struggle, although it's rarely discussed, and that is the relationship between wealth and identity. Many younger family members quietly worry about whether their achievements are genuinely their own, whether opportunities were earned or inherited, whether relationships are authentic, whether they themselves would have succeeded outside the system they were born into. These questions are often much more emotionally significant than families realize, because identity matters deeply at this stage of life. Young people are trying to understand who they are, what they value, what kind of life they wish to build, and whether they're becoming independent adults or merely extensions of an existing system. This is one reason why outside experience matters so much. Not because children need to prove themselves in some theatrical sense, but because they need experiences that belong psychologically to them. Experiences where outcomes are connected even more directly to their own judgment, effort, resilience, and behavior. I've watched enormous confidence emerge in young people simply because they spent time outside the gravitational pull of the family system for a few years, not permanently, just long enough to understand themselves separately from the structure they were born into. That separation almost always strengthens the family system later rather than weakening it, because independence and engagement are not opposites. In healthy families, they reinforce each other. The strongest contributors to family systems are often those who had enough space earlier in life to build genuine independence of thought, not distance from the family, clarity within themselves. And clarity matters greatly because wealthy family systems can become psychologically consuming if identity is never properly separated from the structure itself. I've seen younger family members slowly disappear into roles they were never consciously choosing, not because anyone forced them, but because expectations existed around them for so long that eventually they stopped distinguishing between what was expected and what was truly their own. This is one reason communication matters so profoundly. Not simply discussing structures or succession, discussing freedom, choice, timing, expectations, allowing younger generations to speak honestly without fearing disappointment. Many children in successful families become very skilled at reading parental expectations long before those expectations are ever verbalized. And because they love their parents, they often organize their lives around these assumptions, sometimes without anyone noticing. This is why explicit conversation matters, because silence creates interpretation, and interpretation is often inaccurate. I've watched parents assume they know we support them, while the child themselves believes, I think I'm expected to continue this. I've also watched younger family members assume my parents think I'm not serious about this, while the parents themselves are actually waiting patiently for confidence to emerge naturally. Both sides caring deeply, both sides misunderstanding each other, all because important conversations remain implicit rather than the articulated reality. This is particularly important around succession. Succession is rarely only operational, it is more often, and more importantly, an emotional process. For the older generation, succession often represents mortality, loss of control, or fear that what was built may weaken after them. For the younger generation, succession represents pressure, uncertainty, visibility, fear of inadequacy. Both generations are frequently anxious simultaneously, whilst pretending not to be. And when nobody says this openly, systems become emotionally heavy. The irony is that many family tensions reduce substantially once people begin speaking more honestly. Not perfectly, not emotionally, not dramatically, just honestly. I'm uncertain about this. I'm worried about this. I don't yet feel fully ready. I need more explanation. I need more involvement. Or equally, I find it difficult to let go. I worry about burdening you. I'm trying to protect you. These are profoundly human conversations, and families that can eventually have them usually become much more stable over time. Not because conflict disappears. After all, conflict exists in every family, but because misunderstandings reduce. And misunderstandings are often far more destructive than disagreement itself. There's one final area I would encourage you to think about carefully, and that is the difference between obedience and preparedness. These are not the same thing. Many younger family members learn how to behave appropriately long before they feel genuinely prepared internally. They learn how to sit in meetings, how to speak carefully, how to avoid conflict, how to appear composed, and how to follow expectations. But preparedness is something deeper. Preparedness means understanding why decisions are made, being capable of independent judgment, being able to tolerate uncertainty, and being willing to ask difficult questions. And that distinction matters enormously because systems survive through judgment, not obedience. And so perhaps this is where I should finally explain why I said at the beginning of this conversation that I need your help. Because what happens next in your family will not primarily be determined by the structures you created, nor by the advisors surrounding them, not even by the amount of wealth itself. It will be determined by whether your next generation develops the confidence, judgment, emotional stability, and sense of responsibility required to carry what is gradually moving towards them. And that process cannot be outsourced. It has to happen inside the family itself. Not perfectly, not through grand speeches or dramatic interventions, but through many small moments repeated consistently over time, moments of explanation over dinner, moments of inclusion at the office, moments of honesty during a walk, moments where younger family members are allowed to see not only the outcomes of responsibility, but also the reality of it. In complexity, in uncertainty, in occasional loneliness, and also in its meaning. Because there is meaning in stewardship when it is approached consciously. There is meaning in preserving something carefully across generations. There is meaning in helping younger family members become not simply beneficiaries of wealth, but capable custodians of responsibility. And if you do this well, something remarkable can happen. And that is that the relationship between the next generation and the family system can change. Uncertainty can gradually become confidence. Distance can become engagement. Silence can become conversation. Responsibilities can stop feeling like a burden approaching them from the outside and begin to feel like something understandable, manageable, and eventually meaningful. And perhaps most importantly of all, your children or younger family members can begin to feel something that every successful family ultimately hopes for, whether they express it openly or not, that they have been trusted enough to grow into it. That feeling changes people, because trust, when it is experienced properly, tends to call people upwards towards the best version of themselves. And one day, often much later than expected, you may suddenly notice something very important. It could be a conversation handled thoughtfully, a difficult decision approached calmly, a moment of judgment that feels grounded rather than reactive, a younger family member explaining something carefully to the generation behind them. And in that moment, you can realize that what has actually been transferred was never wealth. It was the ability to carry responsibility without being overwhelmed by it. And that is a real continuity that most families are searching for. Not simply the preservation of assets, but the preservation of capability. And if you can help create that patiently, deliberately over time, then the reward is profound. Not because everything will be perfect. No family ever is. But because the people you care about most will feel less alone inside the responsibility that they are going to inherit from you. And that may ultimately be one of the greatest gifts you can ever hope to pass forward, the greatest inheritance, your greatest legacy. And now the journey is complete. Good luck. I am Alexander von der Fern.